Kayla Giordano, you are the Senior Strategic Initiatives Manager at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Jack. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
So, I wanted to focus this interview on the 2025 State of Housing in Connecticut report that you and the team at the Partnership for Strong Communities recently put out. And I just have to say at the top, looking through this report was a really great experience for me. Even, as someone who's an advocate myself, and who's kind of, to a certain extent, embroiled in these issues, I learned a ton. It's comprehensive, well designed, and interesting. So I want to thank you so much for working to put this together. At the high level, the report found that Connecticut residents are facing high housing costs and that Connecticut is failing to meet the level of production and diversity of housing options necessary to deal with these costs. So tell me more about these sort of big picture findings.
Sure. And thank you for your comments on the report. It's always nice to hear positive feedback. The team worked really, really hard, and like so much credit to everyone at the partnership who helped us put this together, and also some external folks who really helped us to think globally about how to address all of the topics that are so important to housing, the state of housing in Connecticut. Um, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? That ultimately this report is emphasizing two things. One, we have an affordability crisis in Connecticut, and that crisis really impacts everyone. And secondarily, a big piece of that crisis is driven by our lack of housing supply in the state. Just full stop. We know that we do not have enough housing in all of the locations that we need it for all of the different types of people in the housing that they require or would like to live in. And that they would like to live in is a piece of this as well, because housing choice is so important. So when we talk about creating enough housing in the state, having sufficient supply, it doesn't just come down to there's enough houses for every person to live somewhere. It's also about having choice where people want to live, places that are close to their jobs, close to family, extracurriculars, and have the things that they value as people.
Yeah, so the report mentioned transit-oriented development, transit-oriented communities, as we've begun to call it. Um, Speak to that because you just mentioned that where housing is actually placed matters. Why around transit hubs, for example?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. We know that transit-oriented communities are beneficial in a number of ways. They're beneficial for addressing climate change because denser housing that's near transit encourages use of those options. And we are such, right now, especially in Connecticut, a really car-centered society. When you look historically of how the suburbs sort of popped up around the cities and people started to flee cities to move to the suburbs, and the rise of needing a car to be able to go to work. We've built our communities around that. And so how do we shift people from a car-centric mindset to a more transit-oriented mindset? That's by bringing people back closer to transit, encouraging use of transit. And obviously we know that that's helpful for addressing climate change. And just also it allows people to have more choice about where they live, because if they do have access to that transit, they don't need to worry so much about, oh, if I live here, I won't be able to access a job or I won't be able to visit family. Because if that transit is available, you might be able to say, I really want to live in New Haven because it has, so much culture, there's museums, it's also an easy way for me to get into New York City, but my job is maybe in Guilford or Madison on the shoreline, but maybe you can't afford to live in Madison. So having those transit-oriented options that allow you to access different parts of the state while being able to choose the place that works best for you to live, is really important.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about housing options because I think when most people think about the housing that's built in America, they think mostly about, detached single family homes or these sort of large big box apartment buildings. But that's not all that we can build, even if that's a lot of what we can see. We didn't always build that way. What would true housing diversity look like in Connecticut?
That's a tough, I mean, it just comes down to all different types of housing in all different types of places that fit the needs of all different types of people. Right now in Connecticut, as I'm sure you know, being with Pro Home CT, single family detached homes, like your traditional suburban home, make up like over 90% of Connecticut's housing stock. And when we look historically at even the types of that 90%, prior to 1970, Connecticut was building a lot of starter homes, affordable homes for young families able to access in the communities they wanted to live in. And that has really dropped off in the financial crisis that happened around the 80s and then again in the 2008 financial crisis. And what we saw at that time was a shift to building a lot more large single family homes. So something you might call like a McMansion, properties that are, over 2,500 square feet and are expensive and not always what like a young couple might want to move into as their first home or could even afford. So, of that 90%, a lot of the homes that have been built in the last 40 or 50 years are large and unaffordable. So, on that front, when we think about people who might still want to live in a single family home. And that's totally fine, right? Like, we are not here to tell people you should want to live downtown, or you should only want to live downtown or in a dense apartment building, because everyone has preferences, right? But what we do want to see is more smaller homes, maybe communities, condos. I myself live in a condo and I love the ability to like have and own my own space, but still have it's like a dense housing, right? We're 72 units and have neighbors and community, a walkable neighborhood. So thinking about how do we provide single family housing options to people who still want it, but in a better way. And part of that is the creation of more starter homes, which are affordable and accessible to people, and hopefully will remain affordable when people want to move on to something bigger, if they have a family. And we also want to see for on the other side, some people don't want to be in charge of mowing a lawn, replacing their roof, dealing with everything
Mhm.
that like home ownership comes with, or they might not be ready for it. And so having apartments all across the state so that people can choose where they want to live at whatever time of life it is for them, whether they're a recent college graduate or maybe a senior who's looking to downsize. Like those opportunities are really important as well. And we just don't have that in Connecticut right now. Earlier this year, my colleague, Dr. Smile Adelaide, who's our senior policy fellow, wrote a report highlighting Connecticut's issues with rental deserts. And those basically just mean like places where there is not opportunity to rent an apartment. And 41% of Connecticut's census tracts are considered rental deserts, where there are less than 20% of homes available to rent. So that's like almost half the state or half of the census tracts in the state
Wow.
where people just might not be able to find a place to live that works for them at this time in their life.
That's incredible. And I mean, what it seems like we're getting down to and what the report says and what you're saying is that the key here is multifaceted. There's not one solution that's a silver bullet that can solve the issue, both in terms of the housing type that we are looking at building and you know allowing people to live in, but also just generally in terms of solutions. At Pro Home CT, we believe in the all of the above approach. Um, I'd be, curious to know what's top of mind for the partnership in terms of general solutions to the housing crisis. I mean, I saw everything from community land trusts to, modular construction of homes. I'd love to be just kind of taken down, part of the list of just ideas because there really are so many interesting ones and they all kind of play a small role in this larger project of affordability.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there is no silver bullet. to solving the housing crisis. It'd be so much easier if it was, right? To be able to just say, let's pull this one lever, and all of a sudden everyone will have an affordable home in an equitable community of their choice. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and we do have to take a multifaceted approach and think about innovative ways that we can address the housing crisis, right? So, on the front, we know that one of the answers is increase supply. We need to build more homes in a variety of communities, but I think it's also important to be intentional about the types of homes and how we take on that challenge of increasing supply and where we invest our dollars to do so. The private market is always going to be a partner in creating housing development and especially market rate housing. So, at the partnership, one of our core tenets is around affordability. So, we are thinking from a lens of how do we create homes, but how do we also ensure that they're affordable? And so, some of the solutions that we highlight and innovative strategies that we talk about in the State of Housing in Connecticut report are ways that we can do that. So, one of the things that you mentioned we talk about is the rise or really resurgence of modular home construction. We're seeing across the country this method that was really popular post World War II to create rapid housing across the country. That, of course, was restricted to primarily white male homebuyers. To bring that strategy back of rapid home construction, but make sure that it is available and accessible to everyone. And modular construction is basically just we're prefabricating the homes off-site, and then we're bringing them to the piece of land to put them together. And it is significantly, in most cases, significantly cheaper than what we would call stick-built construction, which is really what we've been doing for the past 70 years or so, which is the construction folks come on site and they frame the house there. Everything is done custom. And that's very expensive. And also one of the reasons that we've seen home construction leaning that way in the past few decades, because when a home costs more to put together, the contractor can also charge more to sell it. And so there's a piece of that there. So bringing back that modular construction. And then also thinking 3D printing has been emerging across the country as a solution to quicker housing development.
Wow.
Habitat for Humanity in Virginia has 3D printed a number of homes out of concrete. There's a really amazing video that you can watch on their YouTube page of the frame of the house being built and in a number of, I want to say the entire frame was laid in less than 36 hours, which is really fast.
That is incredible. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
And what was great about that is it allowed, because it's so fast, right? The construction time is less. That means that the cost putting things together is less because time is money. They were able to sell that property to a first-time home buyer in Virginia at a fraction of the cost of what if that person had just bought a home from another person selling their property in that community. So beneficial for Habitat being able to construct homes faster and beneficial to this prospective home buyer who was able to access an affordable home in their community of their choice. And in Maine, they've also applied 3D printing with recycled wood pulp, which is really environmentally friendly, to build supportive housing for folks who are struggling with homelessness. So these are all strategies that I'm hoping we're going to see starting to be talked about in Connecticut. How can we tap into some of these innovative new methodologies to accelerate our home building and also create accessible homes?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is just an incredible amount of momentum on this issue across the country, and honestly, a reminder for me that things aren't all bad.
Yes, that's what I'm glad you brought that up because,
Nuance. There's nuance here.
there's nuance. And, when we were writing the State of Housing in Connecticut report and just really entrenched in the research, the data, it can be a little disheartening to realize, oh, so many people are struggling. We've been underproducing housing for so long. How are we ever going to be able to make progress on this issue?
Right.
And it can, and you're an advocate as well. I've been doing this for a long time. It can be it can make you sad, right? But then you see, wow, there are a lot of innovative solutions. There are things that are being done, and a lot of really dedicated people who are super excited to help solve this issue. And then you start to feel a little lighter, like, oh, we can actually do this. It's just one step at a time. It might take longer than we hope that it will, but if we if we can all be in agreement that housing is a human right, that communities are important, that people are important, then we can build momentum and make change.
Yeah. So speaking of a step that we've taken here, the report addresses the fact that we passed HB 8002, that Connecticut, that is now law. This is the big housing bill that was passed through the legislature in special session last year. And it includes several elements, as the report mentions: new regional and local housing growth planning system, updates to key land use requirements, and expansion of state capacity to support housing development. Walk me through what this means for the state of housing in Connecticut.
Sure. So I think HB 8002 is a really good start. There's a lot in here that I'm hoping will help to build momentum and movement for us to see housing supply increase across the state. I'll talk very briefly about a couple non-supply side pieces of the bill that I think are critically important and I really want to see elevated and to see more movement on. So, really happy to see that there are also provisions in the bill that bring positive change really quickly. Because, as we've discussed, and as most people who have worked in the housing industry for a long time know, supply takes a long time to happen. Even once a project gets funded, you're looking at a year to 2 years of construction to actually being able to lease up those units. In the meantime, a ton of people in Connecticut are suffering today with housing insecurity, unaffordability, instability. And so, really happy to see that 8002 did start to address some of those things. I'm talking about the expansion of fair rent commissions across the state. So, 8002 lowered the population requirement for a town to establish a fair rent commission to 15,000 or more. That's down from 25,000. And that means about 24 new towns are required to establish fair rent commissions, which means more tenants are represented and will have recourse against unfair rent increases. And that's really, really important, especially because we have not yet been able to pass just cause eviction protections in the state. So this is something that at least tenants have some recourse. The bill also created a ban against algorithmic rent prices and reestablished the open choice voucher program, which is going to fund an additional 20 new rental assistance program vouchers.
Yeah. And that's
So,
particularly huge because I think there's such an anxiety, particularly among young people, about the fact that technology could end up being the reason why they can't afford the future, like this kind of techno nihilism. People are interested in that. I'm glad you mentioned that.
yeah, and an issue that like generally seems pretty bipartisan, which
Absolutely.
is good because that can be a real challenge around some of these housing and community development issues. So, really excited to see those really like on the ground. This is going to help people right now to do. And then on the housing supply front, I think, the governor has frequently referred to 8002 as like, towns take the lead. And I think that that shows that the major provisions put forward in the bill, it well represents that. We're tasking municipalities to create their own housing growth plans or partner with a council of government or COG to establish a regional one. And these provisions do sort of push municipalities to determine how they want to incorporate housing into their communities that is a little more open ended and is really dependent on that community voice. My hope is that the communities are going to take this charge seriously. Historically, there have been areas that are opposed to development that haven't necessarily been willing to compromise on figuring out ways that they can add to housing supply in a way that feels authentic to them. And I think holding looking forward on implementation and sort of what comes next, I think holding these communities accountable to creating and implementing their housing growth plans is really going to be critical because 8002 is a great start, but the implementation is where we're going to see whether we've pushed far enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting framing as a beginning because I think there are a lot of also voices in the state who think it's already gone too far. Um,
Yes.
Curious to know why you think it is that the issue has become so politically fraught and frankly partisan, this bill in particular, at the state level, when at the local level and across the country with various, states with various political leanings and frankly, more ambitious bills. They've achieved housing reform with sweeping majorities. It is just not controversial to bring down prices in the way that it can be here. Um, why do you think that is?
So it's a really interesting question, and I addressed it a little bit in an op-ed that I wrote after YIMBY Town this past fall. Um, and in that op-ed, I talk a little bit about how, for some reason, Connecticut thinks that we're really unique. We think we don't have the same problems that other states have, that we can't do the same things that other states have to address housing, and that if we do, something very bad is going to happen. My response to that is we are not unique. We have the same issues, partisan issues, sphere issues around housing development, around change that every other place has. And ultimately, I just really think it comes down to having the courage and political will to look past the loudest voices that are really hoping to maintain the status quo and to pass evidence based policies that are going to move the needle to create more housing. It's really a courage and political will issue. And I would love to see Connecticut, right? We passed 8002 and that was something, right? We're happy to have it, but have that political will to move forward and say, we know some people are not going to be happy with this, but ultimately, everything tells us, the research tells us, what other states are doing tells us that these housing policies, creating more housing, passing just cause eviction protections that many other states have done, are good for communities. And you might not believe us right now, but when it happens, you'll see the results. In terms of, what other states have accomplished, I think it's great that we are seeing reform, particularly around zoning reform. That seems to be can be a nonpartisan issue in some of the red states. And at YIMBY Town, there were several red states that came and talked about sort of how they had done ADU reform or single stair reform and were able to pass that, under a bipartisan framework. And I'm excited that they have done that, but also at the same time, a little bit wary of duplicating their exact strategy. And I'll say that because many of these states have successfully passed these reforms by really emphasizing the economic benefit of like more open market policies, right? Like open up zoning, kind of let people do what they want. ADUs, let people build on their property. It's good for the economy, brings in business, et cetera. And on the one hand, that's really great. Creating opportunities for more housing does have a strong economic benefit. It also brings additional partners to the table, and it's always great to kind of have like strange bedfellows. We might
Sure.
not always
The
agree.
Big Ten, right?
Big tent, yes. On the other hand, I think it's important that we don't always lean too heavily on the narrative that housing is only important for its economic benefits, or the
Mm,
narrative that
mm.
which is often discussed like, oh, build housing in your community for firefighters, for teachers, first responders, which is great. Everyone should have housing. We should build housing there. But at the same time, housing is a human right for everybody, not just for the folks who we think bring the most benefit for our communities or are the most deserving of it. And there are going to be policies that are important for protecting underserved communities, for people who are on the margins, that aren't always going to have an economic benefit. Sometimes we do things because it's the right thing to do and not just because it's beneficial for the economy. And so both things can be true, right? We should have a big tent. We can talk about the economic benefits of some of these policies, but at the same time, we also have to think about how do we ensure that the narrative isn't just around what benefits the economy, but also what benefits people and what benefits communities.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that sort of same pushback then in the context of change and the individuals that maybe are calling their representatives and stopping, bills like HB 8002. What do you have to say to someone who is who sort of likes their community the way that it is, or at least from their perspective, they think that not changing, we hear character of the neighborhood, we hear,
Hmm.
a small town feel. Um, what do you sort of make of that critique, and how has, you know, what's the response there?
Yeah. So whenever this topic of like NIMBYism comes up, right? As a housing advocate, my first reaction, and I'm sure for many other people, is, oh, what's wrong with these people? Like, come on board, understand why this is so necessary. But that's just that gut reaction. When you think about it a little more deeply, ultimately, we understand that a lot of people who are against new housing development or changes in their community are just ultimately fearful. The negative rhetoric and misinformation around creating new homes is really persuasive, especially when it appeals to people's fears of losing something that's important to them. Uh, you know, the environment, quality schools, quiet neighborhoods, property values. These are all reasonable things for someone to be, reasonable things for someone who has invested a lot of time, a lot of energy into their community to be worried about.
Absolutely.
Property values, especially, right? For most people, unfortunately, the way that our economy and is structured in America as a capitalist society, people's homes are often their largest investment. They're depending on their home to help get their children through college, to fund their retirement. So it makes sense that when, someone comes to them hoping to help get them to a zoning meeting to oppose a new development and says, this is going to tank the property value of your home. This is going to overcrowd our schools. It's a logical response to think, I need to stop that. It makes sense. Unfortunately, so much of that rhetoric is misinformation. And there are many, many studies that discredit those things. There's studies that discredit the fact that affordable housing reduces property values. There's research that shows that generally new development does not result in overcrowding of schools. So it's really, up to us to figure out how do we better explain that those things are not true fears that people should have because they're not outcomes that we see as a result of creating more homes in our communities. And that's really difficult. We see it nationally how difficult it is to alter those fear-based narratives because they appeal to like our individual baser instincts. And so, how do we start to shift the conversation from you should be afraid of this to emphasizing the benefits of more homes and communities? If you build in your community, you will see more small businesses because there will be more people. If you create new housing in your communities, your children will be able to come and purchase a home there. And if they have children one day, you'll be close to your grandkids. If you want to sell your large house when you're older and downsized, but you don't want to move to somewhere else, now there's a home for you here. So, how do we talk about those positive aspects? And I don't have all of the answers, but a lot of us are talking about how do we appeal to that narrative change?
I mean, it's such an important point because at the end of the day, you're right. It's people just like us who want to be able to afford to live. Um, to live in a community that they enjoy with people that they love and friends that are close to them. And those interests, you know, everyone shares in common, no matter how we get there. Um, so I guess for the last question here, I'd be curious to know what motivates you personally to work to understand and really address these issues of the housing crisis. What animates your advocacy?
Sure. I think ultimately a lot of my passion for this work has come from the passion that I have seen other people bring to the space. So I went to college for political science and economics, and I did not have it in my mind that I was going to end up doing housing research or be in this field. It just so happened that a friend of mine who I had gone to college with that had graduated the year before me was planning to go to grad school and leave the job that she had worked in the year after she had graduated. And that was with a community development financial institution. I don't know if you're familiar with what a
Vaguely.
CDFI is. Okay, so basically, they're a nonprofit bank, is kind of how I would describe
Okay,
them. They
interesting.
provide financing to a variety of small businesses, housing creation, et cetera, in to borrowers who might not be credit worthy to traditional banks. And when I went to work there, I started underwriting loans for the financing of housing development by real community developers. And by that, I mean the pastor of a church who was looking to buy a couple of vacant and blighted buildings on the street where his congregation was, rehab them, and sell them to home buyers from his congregation. And that experience in learning like, oh, this is what it takes to create new housing, and oh, these are the struggles that these people have in finding an affordable place, so much so that basically they had to solve the problem themselves. Like, how do we do this for our local community? Seeing the passion that they brought to this issue and learning about the expanse of how the intersectionality of housing, how it touches
Mm,
basically every aspect of our lives, that really was something that I had never understood before because I grew up in a rural single family home, never worrying about where I was going to go to bed at night. And that is, really what drives me is like I want that for everyone. No one should have to worry about where they sleep at night, and the amount of passion and hard work that the other advocates bring to the housing space is very much an inspiration to me personally.
absolutely. Well, I'm feeding off of your passion today. Kayla Giordano, Senior Strategic Initiatives Manager at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate you having me.